One of the ways to revise this is just on one page. I mean, that would be reduced.
Yeah.
And those categories would be under
underneath,
assumed responsibility
Or we could label those as like, give these letter labels, and on the back put letter labels with each of those areas.
I don't.
I'd like one sheet.
I think it has to be right in front of the
diagram
faces.
and has the pieces
nice
underneath it. And
When I flip it over, I'm already forgetting.
Exactly.
that's right.
Yeah.
Exactly.
It's complicated enough the way it looks.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, maybe
Or you could do it.
we don't even have to
I should
present
pull out my
that
own.
graphic itself.
So do we think this worked?
I do.
Sorta?
I do think it works.
I have a hard, I mean, you've taught this before. I mean, I haven't to that degree. So, I mean, I've done intro psych, but that was like 10 years ago, and I couldn't tell you whether they got it then or not. But
Right. I don't know.
It'd be interesting to go back, though, and giving them something kind of like a pre-thing, or just in general, knowing kind of what they know right off the bat, and then
Beginning of the semester.
through Carmen's class and then through yours and see what the differences would be.
Makes me wonder, too, about whether there's a bigger lesson in this that they're getting. I don't know what it is, but that response that I'm now getting from these students about how we wanted them to get the idea of social influence, that when people are in groups they do things that they might not do otherwise. That's kind of inescapable now.
Mm-hmm.
And they really have that sense.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm wondering if that isn't really reinforced by this.
Because we didn't talk about that at all.
You know, but it's kind of interesting because you said that students were coming back to you and talking about, social psych, yacht kind of thing. It would be almost interesting to get them to reflect and say, okay, now that we've done social psychology, what have you learned? What are you going to take away, and what do you think about now? And see whether some of this bystander stuff comes up, or cooperation, coercion, and all those things.
That's the kind of thing I want to think about too, because here's this little self-contained lesson, and it shows us some things about what they got that day from it, related to this particular subject matter. But it seemed like one of the things we were after was this whole idea of using a model to make predictions, or seeing it as more complicated than the one-factor theory that explains everything.
Right.
And also now I'm wondering, like you said, if there isn't something bigger coming out of this. And I don't know that I could disentangle that from the other things we've talked about in social psych either.
Right.
They kind of go together.
Right, and I think probably you can't. I think it's probably this in combination with everything else that has led to that bigger sense. But I think that bigger sense is a really important piece.
Yeah.
That I'm sure that students in the large general psych that we teach probably don't get that bigger piece. They probably don't, because there's not as much. I don't think there's as much. There's not as much interaction. We move from topic to topic. There's 300 people in the class, and there we stand, and I think it's harder to get them to kind of integrate the pieces within areas and come to those sorts of conclusions.
So I was thinking in terms of, how it went. Of one thing was, we should think back to what was the goal we wanted to accomplish.
Yeah.
And one, I didn't go back to the exact notes, but my recollection is one thing is them seeing multiple factors influencing behavior. Clearly, that has come through, and that, while they may have got over-focused on one thing, this really forced them to see a variety of factors that are going to influence whether or not somebody behaves in this situation in a particular way.
I agree. I think it's completely
and so
successful
in accomplishing
from
that,
that point of view.
That definitely was done.
I think in some ways, too, it kind of challenged them to kind of think of the scenario as far as what their reactions would be. And it was interesting that the car one where they talked about it, there was really a lot of discussion on kind of, the circumstances around it. And kind of what we predicted they would go with as far as, if we put in there that the person was having a bad day or that they were really depressed, well, then for sure I would stop. But I guess I don't know that, so I don't know whether I would stop or not.
Right.
And it was like,
Yeah.
well, yeah.
Your group was highly speculative.
Yeah. So, I think that it did challenge them to kind of, just go with the scenario and think of those different pieces. And here I'd help and here I would not. And that's kind of, I thought that was good.
I almost wonder about being too successful in terms of generating all the possibilities.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
you could be left with
Then how do
the
you
impression
do
like,
practice?
oh,
There's
you'll
no way
never
to
know. Yeah,
That's
you'll
right.
never know
That's right.
because there are all these possible
Right.
factors that are influencing people
Although
in
I
the
think
situation.
that if we can find some way to better tie it to here,
Yeah.
to say, okay, you've got these categories, and let's figure out how do these categories fit this bigger, more generalized and generalizable model. Like interprets incident as an emergency. Do they ask for help? Do they look like they need help? Do they look blue in the face? I mean, all of those things would fit here. Do you assume responsibility? No, because it's too dangerous. No, because I don't like the person or whatever. So they can start to put some of these things really in here, and then I think you get this, bigger picture.
Bigger sense of the coherence of it.
Yeah, so that it is predictable. To some degree anyway.
So that would almost cause us to need to reclassify their responses with the model up and say, okay, those of you that talked about these factors, that's what would go under this
Right.
box here.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's kind of what they did here.
Okay.
I mean, they were
Yeah.
trying to do that. I mean, they looked
Yeah.
at the back sheet and looked at perceived costs,
Right.
which is a very high level category
Right.
that
Exactly.
includes many
Right.
things. What
Right.
damage is going to be done, or
Exactly.
what benefits am I
Yeah.
going to get out of the situation.
Yeah.
So they started to do that.
Yeah, for sure.
Good.
Right.
But I think it's
yeah,
kind of
bringing the
incipient.
individual
It's just
task
kind of.
in.
I went through this quick. I mean, they did that in 5 minutes, probably.
Yeah.
It's interesting now, having done this, that it's making me think about the original goal. And, I mean, part of it was sort of this high-minded and kind of general idea of thinking in terms of relationships. And on one level, they did that. I mean, they produced all these things, so they're looking at these little antecedents. But now it seems like the goal is to sort of refine that, to sort of get them to the point where they can understand that there's a way of making this more systematic. That there's a way of thinking about this systematically so that it's not just every man and woman for himself here,
Right.
depending on their characteristics.
Right, flip
But
a coin, yeah.
there's some way of fitting this together where the world is a little more predictable.
Right.
That there are these models that do, account, in pretty good ways for this kind of behavior. I don't think that part's there yet.
Yeah, I would agree.